They were running out of places to hide. For the Arakton, the flight had begun centuries ago. Once a race of explorers, they now found themselves scavenging the stars, fleeing from a force that annihilated entire civilizations without hesitation. Their empire was long gone, reduced to drifting fleets and isolated survivors, all looking for a place, any place where the invincible tide might not follow. Kjartan stood on the observation deck of the Varluk, one of the last Arakton dreadnoughts. His eyes, once filled with the fiery ambition of discovery, now reflected only exhaustion. Before him stretched the image of a planet, small and blue amidst the infinite black, Earth. "It doesn't look like much," muttered Sarl, the ship's chief navigator, his once pristine uniform in tatters, his voice lined with weariness. "No," Kjartan replied softly, "but it's all we have left." The Varluk was not alone. Dozens of ships, some still functional, others barely holding together, floated in the cold vacuum nearby. Each of these vessels carried refugees, not just from the Arakton, but from the scattered remains of other species. The Lysorians, whose crystalline cities had melted into rivers of glass. The Tharn, whose desert worlds had been reduced to dust. All of them fled the same enemy. A force that did not conquer. It erased. No one knew what to call them. The Lysorians had named them the Nameless, a fitting title for creatures that left no survivors to tell their stories. They appeared from the depths of the void, descending on planets with terrifying precision, overwhelming all resistance. Their methods were as varied as they were ruthless. Sometimes they attacked with sheer firepower, other times they unleashed viruses that wiped out entire populations in days. But they were always thorough. Worlds once teeming with life became barren wastelands. Kjartan had seen it happen too many times. The homeworlds of his allies, his own planets, everything they had built, destroyed. His people had been proud explorers once, venturing across the stars with a curiosity unmatched. Now, they were little more than beggars, hoping that this obscure corner of the galaxy might offer safety. "We've scanned their defenses," Sarl continued, frowning at his console. "Primitive. They've barely begun exploring their own system. Their technology, it's centuries behind ours. They won't stand a chance if the Nameless find them," Kjartan said grimly. And yet, there was something about this planet. Earth. It wasn't just the blue of the oceans or the strange green of the land masses that caught his attention. It was the silence. The Nameless hadn't found this world. Somehow, this tiny, isolated planet had been overlooked, hidden away by luck or by fate. For how long, though, was the question. "We have no choice," said Kjartan, his voice steady despite the weight of the decision. "We land." The Varluk groaned as its engines kicked to life, followed by the ragtag fleet behind it. Ships that had once been symbols of great power now limped toward the planet like wounded animals seeking shelter. Kjartan watched as the blue orb grew larger on the viewports, a sense of dread creeping over him. Earth was beautiful, in a way. Unspoiled by the horrors that had consumed so many other worlds, but beauty did not last. Not in this galaxy. Sarl glanced at him, hesitation in his eyes. "What do we tell them? The humans?" Kjartan didn't answer immediately. What could they tell them? That they were bringing death to their doorstep? That their planet, peaceful and quiet, was about to become the final stand against an unstoppable force? There was no easy way to explain what was coming. "They need to know the truth," Kjartan finally said. "But not all of it. Not yet." He turned to the view screen as the surface of Earth came into clearer focus. The humans would learn soon enough. First contact was always unpredictable, and Kjartan could only hope that they would not react with hostility. They needed time to prepare, time to unite, but there was no escaping what would follow. "They'll fight us," Sarl added quietly. "They always do." Kjartan nodded. "At first." The ships began their descent into Earth's atmosphere, and as the clouds parted below them, cities and oceans came into view. The humans would fight, just as every species had fought when they realized the scale of the threat. But Earth was different. It wasn't just another world on their long list of failed refuges. There were no more places to run. The descent was silent, despite the chaos that was about to unfold below. Earth's skies, once serene, were now filled with vessels unlike anything humanity had ever seen. The Varluk and its fleet drifted into Earth's atmosphere, cloaked from human detection for now, but that wouldn't last long. Kjartan knew that this first contact would be critical. Missteps could cost them everything. On the ground, in a remote military base tucked away in the Nevada desert, radar technicians were the first to notice. Corporal Mendez, running diagnostics on outdated equipment, squinted at his screen as an impossible reading blinked onto the radar. "Hey, you seeing this?" he muttered, nudging his colleague, Private Lennox, who was nursing a cup of coffee. "What now?" Lennox groaned, leaning over to inspect the flickering display. His face paled. "What the hell?" The radar lit up with dozens of blips, large, fast-moving objects that had appeared from nowhere. "That's not a drill," Mendez whispered, his voice tight with alarm. "Get the commander!" Before Lennox could respond, the alarms began blaring across the base. Across the planet, similar scenes were unfolding as military installations scrambled to comprehend what was happening. The skies had been clear minutes before, but now, objects too massive to be natural phenomena were approaching. Humanity's greatest fear was being realized. They were not alone. In Washington, President Kalanoff was hastily escorted into the Situation Room, where her advisors were already gathered, voices raised in confusion and panic. "Madam President," General Mathis snapped to attention as she entered, "we have unidentified objects entering our atmosphere. Too many to be a coincidence. This is..." He hesitated, his stern military demeanor slipping for a moment. "This is unprecedented." Kalanoff stared at the screens displaying the incomprehensible data from military installations worldwide. "What are they?" she asked, her voice steady despite the churn of anxiety rising within her. "We don't know, ma'am. They're not responding to any communications, and we haven't detected any signs of aggression yet. But they're alien, aren't they?" she interrupted. "Don't sugarcoat it. We're dealing with first contact." Mathis swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am. That's the conclusion we're leaning toward." The room fell into a tense silence. Every eye was on Kalanoff as she processed the enormity of the situation. For decades, humanity had speculated about this moment, about what would happen when they finally made contact with extraterrestrial life, and now it was here, sudden and without warning. The question was, what kind of contact would this be? "Let's not make any moves that could be interpreted as hostile," Kalanoff finally said, her mind racing. "But I want every defense system on high alert. If they fire, we fire back." Meanwhile, above the clouds, Kjartan and his crew prepared to make their move. The ships hovered, unseen by human eyes but carefully monitored by every radar on the planet. Their cloaking technology was starting to fail, a necessary risk to ensure they could study human behavior without provoking immediate violence. Kjartan knew they had to reveal themselves soon. "They're scared," said Sarl, studying the human transmissions they'd intercepted. "Scared and confused." Kjartan grimaced. "It's understandable. We've shown up uninvited, and they have no idea what's chasing us." On the surface, humanity's confusion was boiling into chaos. News outlets scrambled to report on the mysterious objects, while social media buzzed with fear and conspiracy theories. Were they invaders? Scientists? Explorers? No one knew, and the lack of information only fed the rising panic. At the United Nations, representatives from major world powers were already in heated discussions, scrambling to form a united response. But the truth was, humanity was not united. Rivalries, distrust, and power struggles threatened to derail any coordinated effort. Some nations wanted to reach out in peace, others were already preparing their military forces for conflict. Kjartan watched the transmission feeds from his command chair aboard the Varlook. Earth's leaders were floundering, unsure whether to see the alien arrival as an opportunity or a threat. The fleet would be visible soon, and Kjartan knew that once humans saw their true size, the window for diplomacy would close rapidly. "It's time," he said quietly, turning to his communications officer, a Lysorian named Elthis. Her crystalline skin shimmered faintly under the lights of the control room as she prepared the broadcast. "They're not gonna like this." Sarl muttered under his breath. "Maybe not," Kjartan replied, "but we need them, and they need us." The Varlook deactivated its cloaking system first, followed by the rest of the refugee fleet. To the human observers below, it was like watching gods materialize in the sky. Gigantic vessels, some scarred by battles far beyond Earth's understanding, appeared over the major continents. In the cities, people stopped in the streets to stare at the looming shapes above them, Fear and awe battled for dominance in their minds. Then came the message, a voice, clear but distant, broadcast on every available frequency, every screen, every radio. People of Earth, we come in peace. We are refugees, escaping a terrible enemy that will soon be upon us. We seek sanctuary on your world. We bring no harm, but we carry grave warnings. The message played on repeat, sending shockwaves across the globe. People listened, stunned, as the images of the alien ships flashed across every news outlet. The streets of cities worldwide were filled with anxious crowds, everyone trying to comprehend what had just been revealed. In the Situation Room, President Kalanov's knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of the table, listening intently. "Refugees?" she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. The weight of the decision fell on her shoulders. They were asking for help, but could humanity afford to trust them? Mathis, standing beside her, frowned deeply. "They could be lying, ma'am. It's a hell of a way to land on someone's planet if you're just seeking refuge." "They're desperate," Kalanov replied quietly, "and desperate beings do desperate things." She turned to the assembled military advisors, her voice steady as she made her decision. "We'll open a line of communication, but we'll be ready for anything." Kjartan watched Earth's response closely from aboard the Varlook. They weren't firing. That was a good sign, but their hesitation was palpable. These humans would not accept them easily, not without answers. He closed his eyes briefly, thinking of the worlds they had seen fall, the countless lives lost. "Humans don't trust what they don't understand," Sarl said, standing beside him. "And right now, we're the biggest mystery they've ever faced." Kjartan nodded. "They'll have to trust us soon, because what's coming for them doesn't care whether they're ready or not." Far beyond the edge of Earth's solar system, in the cold expanse where no light reached, they were coming. The Nameless had never cared for the politics of survival. They did not care about alliances or peace. They moved with one purpose, guided by a force that had no need for diplomacy. Where they went, civilizations were reduced to dust, forgotten in the void of space. Their motives remained as mysterious as the ships they commanded, silent, unyielding, and utterly without mercy, and they were closing in on Earth. Kjartan felt the shift in the air on the bridge of the Varlook. He stood, hands clasped tightly behind his back, staring at the star map that tracked the progress of the Nameless fleet. Their approach was as relentless as ever, cold, methodical. The humans didn't understand the danger yet, not fully. But soon they would. "They're moving faster than we anticipated," Elthis reported, her crystalline eyes flickering with the pale light of the console. "At this speed, they'll enter the system in 3 standard days." Sarl, standing nearby, cursed under his breath. "They won't make the same mistake twice, Kjartan. They'll hit harder this time." The Lysorian nodded in grim agreement. The Nameless had nearly caught them before, back on Vela 3, when they had dared to stop and fight. The refugees had barely escaped with their lives, leaving behind the last of their planetary defenses. One more world lost. One more graveyard among many. Kjartan exhaled slowly, the weight of his decision pressing against his chest. Earth had been a risk from the start. It wasn't just the humans' relative backwardness or their lack of a united global defense. It was the sheer unpredictability of the planet. Humanity, in all its complexity, was chaotic. Their capacity for both kindness and violence was unparalleled, but there was no other option. The Nameless were close, and there were no other stars to hide behind. "We need to warn them, all of them," Kjartan said, his voice low but resolute. "They need to understand what's coming." "And what then?" Sarl asked, his voice hardening. "What do we expect these humans to do, Kjartan? They can't fight this. They're not ready for it." Kjartan turned slowly to face his old friend. "Neither were we, but we survived longer than most. We fought back. They will too." Sarl's eyes burned with a mixture of frustration and reluctant hope. "They're not like us. They don't know the cost." Kjartan's gaze hardened. "They will soon." On Earth, the tension had reached its breaking point. President Kalanov sat in the dimly lit Situation Room, her face drawn as she listened to the voice of Kjartan broadcast through the secured line. The initial message had been a shock, but the follow-up conversation was far more unsettling. The Nameless were real, a force beyond anything humanity had ever encountered. The invaders weren't coming for diplomacy, trade, or even conquest. They were coming for annihilation. Every military advisor around the table was grim-faced, and Kalinov could feel the weight of their unspoken doubts. How could anyone prepare for something like this? "And you believe they'll arrive in 3 days?" she asked, her voice steady but cold. "Yes," Kjartan's voice came through clearly, though there was no hiding the weariness beneath it. "They'll come in overwhelming numbers. You'll have no time to negotiate or prepare a defense once they arrive. If you don't act now, you'll be wiped out." The room was silent. Kalinov leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "How have you survived this long, Kjartan? What do we need to do?" There was a pause. When he spoke again, his tone was darker, heavier, with the knowledge of countless battles lost. "We didn't survive by building stronger walls or better weapons. We survived by running, and when we couldn't run, we fought like we had nothing left to lose." General Mathis, sitting across from the president, spoke up, his tone sharp. "You're saying we should retreat? That's not an option. This is our home." Kjartan's voice grew firmer. "I'm not telling you to run. You don't have that luxury anymore. But you need to understand this. The Nameless won't stop. You can't hold back their entire force. You have to hit them where it hurts, delay them, buy time, and protect what matters most. Every decision from now on is about survival, nothing else." The room remained tense. Kalinov exchanged a glance with Mathis, who looked ready to argue further, but she raised a hand, stopping him. She understood the cold truth in Kjartan's words. Earth was at a turning point. Either they adapted to this new reality, or they perished. "What do you need from us?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. Kjartan paused, then answered, "Full cooperation. From every nation, every resource you can spare. The Nameless don't differentiate between borders or flags. If your species wants to survive, it will need to act as one." There it was, Kalinov thought. The impossible task. Humanity had never acted as one, not in its entire history. They'd come close, once or twice, but in the end, old grudges, old fears, and the relentless pursuit of power had always torn them apart. Could this threat, the greatest they had ever faced, finally be enough to unify them? "We'll do what we can," she replied cautiously. "But you need to understand something, Kjartan. Humans don't follow orders from anyone, not even each other." "I know," Kjartan said, the weariness returning to his voice. "I've seen it before." Far from the planet, on the edge of the solar system, sensors aboard the Varlock detected the first faint echoes of the approaching threat. The Nameless were entering the system, their ships barely registering against the cold backdrop of space. They moved without warning, without lights, like shadows creeping toward their prey. Kjartan stood on the bridge, watching the data streams filter in. They had hours before the Nameless reached striking distance. Hours to prepare, to finalize Earth's defenses, to unite the scattered forces of humanity. And when the Nameless arrived, there would be no more time for hesitation. "They're here," Elthis whispered, her voice trembling with an edge of fear she couldn't suppress. Kjartan's jaw clenched. He had seen the Nameless obliterate worlds far more advanced than Earth. But there was something different about this planet, something intangible. Humanity was unpredictable, stubborn. There was a rawness to them, an instinct to fight even when the odds were hopeless. "We make our stand here," Kjartan said softly, though every eye on the bridge was already fixed on him. "Earth will either be our salvation or our grave." The Nameless were coming, and there was no turning back. The Nameless arrived like a storm, silent at first, but soon overwhelming, filling the skies above Earth with the dread of an unstoppable force. Their ships, dark and angular, blended into the blackness of space, like predators waiting to strike. No warning shots, no demands for surrender, only cold, methodical destruction. From the moment the first Nameless vessels entered orbit, humanity realized they were not prepared. It wasn't just the size of the fleet, thousands of ships, bristling with weapons beyond comprehension, but the precision with which they struck. Communications satellites blinked out within moments, and global positioning systems faltered, leaving Earth's defenses scrambling in the dark. The first human casualties were instantaneous, as key military installations across the world were vaporized by strikes from the Nameless. Kjartan stood on the bridge of the Varlock, watching the battle unfold. The refugee fleet, battered and exhausted, had taken up positions alongside the humans, their last remaining ships forming a thin defensive line between the Nameless and the planet below. The combined human-alien force was dwarfed by the sheer number of Nameless ships. This wasn't a battle, it was survival. "We can't hold them off like this," Sarl muttered, his eyes scanning the tactical display. "They're cutting through our perimeter like it's nothing." Kjartan's expression remained stony. "We knew this would happen. We can't defeat them head-on." "Then what are we doing?" Elthis asked, her voice edged with desperation as she monitored the collapsing lines of defense. Kjartan's eyes narrowed as he turned to face his crew. "We're buying time. Every second we delay them is another second for the humans to regroup." The strategy had never been about victory. Kjartan knew from the start that the Nameless couldn't be defeated in a single confrontation. They needed to slow them down, force them to divide their attention. Earth's armies were scattered and disorganized, and Kjartan understood that their only chance of survival was to turn this into a war of attrition. But even that hope was slipping away. Outside the ship, Earth's atmosphere was filled with flashes of light, explosions from human and alien vessels alike, as the Nameless carved through their ranks. A human carrier, the Nimrod, erupted in a ball of fire, debris raining down over the Pacific Ocean. Another refugee vessel, the Thalnek, was torn apart by 3 nameless destroyers, its crew of Tharn refugees lost to the vacuum of space in seconds. On the ground, the situation was no better. Major cities were being evacuated, but the Nameless weren't targeting civilians, not yet. Their focus was solely on military infrastructure, systematically dismantling Earth's ability to defend itself. But the humans weren't giving up. Ground forces launched missile strikes, fighter jets scrambled into the sky, and hastily assembled anti-aircraft batteries fired at anything that moved. The fight was desperate, chaotic, and utterly outmatched. In the Situation Room, President Kalinov watched the live feeds from battle zones across the globe, her hands gripping the table. She had been briefed about the Nameless, warned by Kjartan and his people about what was coming, but seeing it unfold was something else entirely. It was worse than she had imagined. "We're losing too much too fast," General Mathis said, his voice hoarse from hours of barking orders. "We need to start pulling back what's left of our forces and regroup somewhere defensible." "There's nowhere defensible," Kalinov snapped, her patience fraying under the strain. "They'll follow us wherever we go." The tactical officer interrupted, his voice tight with urgency. "Ma'am, we have reports that the Nameless have landed on the eastern seaboard. They're deploying ground units." Kalinov closed her eyes for a moment. Ground units. This was it. The Nameless were beginning the final stage. They would wipe out what remained of Earth's resistance, up close and with brutal efficiency. "We need to fight them on the ground," Kalinov said, her voice hardening as she turned to Mathis. "I want every available soldier, every able-bodied civilian, armed and ready. We'll fight them street by street if we have to." Above Earth, the battle in space raged on, though it was clear that the defenders were losing ground. The refugee fleet had already lost half its ships, and the humans were faring no better. Yet they fought on, driven by the knowledge that there was nowhere else to run. Kjartan's mind raced as he analyzed the Nameless strategy. They were being drawn in, too focused on wiping out the larger ships in orbit. It was their one mistake, and Kjartan was determined to exploit it. "Prepare for Phase 2, he ordered, turning to his tactical officer, a hulking Tharn named Varlek. Varlek nodded, his massive hands flying over the control panel. "Coordinates set. We're ready." The plan was simple, if suicidal. Several ships in the refugee fleet, including the Varluk, had been fitted with what was left of their planet-cracking munitions, enough firepower to punch a hole through a small moon. They had been intended for planetary defense, a last-ditch effort to stop the Nameless before they could overrun their worlds. Now, they would be turned into weapons of desperation. "They'll see us coming," Sarl warned, his voice tight with tension. "They'll be too busy to stop us." Kjartan replied grimly, "This is all we have left." The Varluk and a handful of other ships broke formation, moving toward the densest cluster of nameless vessels. It was a kamikaze maneuver, but they had no other options. The goal wasn't to survive, it was to cripple as much of the nameless fleet as possible before they could finish what they had started. On Earth, Kalinov's forces were already engaging the nameless ground troops. The alien soldiers were unlike anything humanity had ever seen. Tall, skeletal figures draped in dark, segmented armor, wielding weapons that disintegrated matter at a touch. Their advance was relentless, carving through human defenses with precision. But the humans fought back with everything they had, their numbers overwhelming, even as the Nameless cut them down. In the heart of New York City, soldiers and civilians alike took up arms, creating makeshift barricades in the streets, launching guerrilla strikes against the advancing Nameless troops. Explosions rocked the city as the two sides clashed, the air thick with smoke and the cries of the dying. "We won't make it," shouted one of the soldiers, taking cover behind a wrecked vehicle. The Nameless had them pinned down, their weapons obliterating anything that stood in their path. But humanity was nothing if not stubborn. They had fought wars before, against each other, against the odds, against their own limits. And now, as their world teetered on the brink of destruction, they would fight again. Back in orbit, the Varlock was nearing its target. Kjartan watched the tactical display as the ship's course locked onto the Nameless command vessel, an enormous ship that controlled the vast majority of the fleet's movements. It was a long shot, but if they could destroy it, they could disrupt the Nameless coordination and buy the humans precious time. "Detonation in 30 seconds, Varlock announced, his deep voice calm despite the chaos around them. Kjartan closed his eyes, thinking of all the worlds they had lost, all the people who had died in the flight from the Nameless. This was it, the final gambit. But then, something unexpected happened, a sudden shift in the Nameless fleet. Their ships hesitated, just for a moment, as if distracted by something unseen. It was enough. The Varlock and its companions slammed into the heart of the Nameless armada, their planet crackers detonating in a blinding flash of light. The explosion ripped through the enemy fleet, tearing dozens of ships apart in an instant. The humans, watching from the surface, saw the massive burst of light in the sky and cheered. It was short-lived. The Nameless still had numbers, but for the first time in the long history of their conquests, they had been wounded. On the ground, in the battered streets of New York and beyond, the fighting continued. The Nameless ground forces had lost their coordination, their advance slowed. It was enough for humanity to regroup, to rally. Kjartan, still alive, but barely conscious aboard the crippled Varlock, stared at the tactical display. Earth was still burning, but for the first time, it wasn't burning alone. The battlefield was quiet, in that strange, eerie way only space could be. The Varlock, crippled and barely operational, drifted among the wreckage of what had once been a fleet. The massive explosion had torn through the Nameless armada, crippling their command vessel and scattering the rest. But it hadn't been enough to stop them completely. Kjartan knew it wouldn't be. He lay slumped in his command chair, blood trickling from a deep cut on his forehead, his vision blurred. The bridge was a mess of smoke, sparks, and debris, but it was still operational, barely. Sarl was unconscious next to him, while Elthis worked furiously at her station, trying to stabilize what systems they had left. Outside, the Nameless were regrouping. Even with their fleet decimated, their sheer numbers were overwhelming. The humans and the remnants of the refugee fleet had bought themselves time, but it wouldn't last. The Nameless had never been defeated, not truly. They would keep coming, no matter the cost, no matter how many ships they lost. But Earth was still here. Somehow, they had survived the first wave. Kjartan forced himself to his feet, staggering toward the tactical display. His legs felt weak, his body worn down by years of running, fighting, and losing. The command console flickered, showing the remnants of the human forces on the ground. They were holding, barely. In New York, in Moscow, in cities across the globe, they had fought back against the Nameless ground troops, pushing them to a standstill. The sight should have given him hope. It didn't. The Nameless didn't stop. They would adapt, reform their lines, and strike again. And this time, they wouldn't make the same mistakes. "Status?" he rasped, his voice hoarse, barely able to stand. Elthis glanced over her shoulder, her face pale and exhausted. "Shields are gone, weapons offline, hull integrity at 30%. She hesitated, swallowing hard. "It's only a matter of time before they come for us again." Kjartan nodded weakly, staring at the ruined fleet outside the viewport. They had given everything, every last weapon, every last ship, every last drop of strength, and it still wouldn't be enough. They won't stop until Earth is ashes, Elthis added, her voice trembling. No, Kjartan whispered, they won't. On the surface, President Kalinov stood in the ruins of what had once been New York City's financial district. The ground was scorched black, buildings toppled, and the streets littered with debris. The battle against the nameless ground troops had devolved into brutal urban warfare, but humanity had fought them back, inch by inch, street by street. Soldiers, police, civilians, all of them had taken up arms, fighting with a ferocity Kalinov had never thought possible. She wiped the dirt from her face, staring up at the sky where flashes of light still flickered in the upper atmosphere. The alien ships loomed like dark shadows over the horizon, but the massive explosion that had rocked the nameless fleet earlier had given Earth the smallest chance to breathe. The question was, how long could they hold on? Madam President, General Mathis approached, his uniform torn and stained with blood. The ground forces report that we've stopped their advance in most of the major cities, but we've taken heavy casualties. And the nameless, they're not retreating, they're regrouping. Kalinov closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders. The reports coming in from across the globe were all the same. Humanity was holding, but only just. There was no end in sight. The nameless would come again, and when they did, there would be nothing left to stop them. We can't fight them like this forever, Mathis said, his voice low. We're running out of everything. Ammo, supplies, people. Kalinov opened her eyes, the exhaustion clear in her expression. I know. She stared up at the sky again. The alien ships still hovered above them like a dark omen. She thought of Kjartan, of the refugees who had brought the nameless to Earth in a desperate bid to survive. They had fought alongside humanity, sacrificed everything, and still, it might not be enough. But they had held the line. Together. What's the status of our remaining forces in orbit, she asked. Mathis shook his head. Most of the refugee fleet is gone, and our remaining ships are barely operational. There's nothing left up there to stop another wave. Kalinov didn't reply immediately. Instead, she took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on the distant stars beyond the nameless ships. Then we make our stand here. We protect this planet with everything we have left. If we go down fighting. Kjartan knew it was over. The Varlook was dead in space, and so were most of the remaining ships. The nameless were reforming, their command structure slowly recovering from the devastating blow. He could see it now, a slow, unstoppable tide coming to finish what they had started. Earth would not survive the next attack. But there was something else in his chest. Something that had sparked the moment he had seen the humans fight back. This was no ordinary world. Humanity, stubborn, unpredictable, and relentless, had done something no one else had ever done. They had stood their ground. They had not run, not like his people, not like the countless others who had fallen before the nameless. Perhaps that was the difference. Earth wasn't just another world to be destroyed, it was the final stand. Not just for humans, but for everyone who had fought, fled, and bled to survive. Elthis, Kjartan croaked, struggling to stay conscious, can you patch me through to their leader? She nodded, though her hands trembled as she worked the console. Seconds later, President Kalinov's face appeared on the screen, bruised and dirty, standing in the ruins of New York. Kjartan, she said, her voice hoarse. It's not looking good. He smiled weakly, his lips cracked and dry. It never does. Kalinov gave a humorless chuckle, though her eyes were lined with worry. What's your situation up there? We're done, he replied simply. What's left of my fleet won't survive another wave. Kalinov bit her lip, glancing over her shoulder as the sounds of battle echoed behind her. Neither will we. Kjartan watched her for a long moment. It doesn't matter if we win. What matters is that we made them bleed. We showed them that this planet isn't just another graveyard, it's the last stand. Kalinov's eyes narrowed. And what happens when they come again? They'll come, Kjartan admitted, his voice faltering. But we've bought you time. Use it. Fight them with everything you have. Fight them until there's nothing left to give. There was a long pause before Kalinov spoke again. You're not coming down, are you? No, he said softly, his voice barely a whisper. This ship, this planet, It's the last place we'll ever know. For a moment, there was only the faint crackle of the damaged comm system between them. Then, slowly, Kolinov nodded. Thank you, Kjartan. You've given us a chance. And then, with a final look at the broken remnants of the fleet, Kjartan closed his eyes, feeling the cold of space seep into the Varluk. They had run for so long, but this time there was nowhere left to go. Earth wasn't just their last stop, it had become their final resting place.